You, Brad, and Martha, for introducing us to this story. Certainly one of the most engaging stories in the entire Bible. But before we get into it, before we begin looking at it as a part of this love story between God and the chosen people, I want to start by looking at another part of the story, one of the side plots or subplots, if you will, that many of us have been reading all along. That story about Job and his relationship with God. Now, Job, as I've mentioned in our newsletter before, was a little bit unique because of the way that it does not connect directly to God's chosen people. Job is one of the very few protagonists who is neither an ancestor nor a descendant of Jacob. And Job's story takes place in the land of Uz, which, although scholars aren't exactly sure where it is, almost certainly falls outside of the realm of Canaan. Beyond that, the story of Job is almost completely self-contained. It doesn't make any references to the other events in the Bible, and there are only 2 chapters in the entire Bible outside of the book that even mention Job by name. And yet it has something very important to contribute to the rest of the story. A number of things, really. For example, it reminds us that God does indeed care about those people who fall outside of the reach and the vision of the chosen people. In fact, that God not only loves them, but speaks and reveals himself to them. But it also, I think, highlights the limits of just how far one can go in their understanding of God outside of the special revelation God gives to the chosen people. Now, in this story, we find that Job and his friends share a very similar view about God that we do today. They only refer to one God, a kind of creator God who oversees everything in the book. They also seem to understand that this God is responsible for ensuring justice. And Job's friends believe that he does a pretty good job of maintaining justice, which apparently Job also believed up to the point that he experienced some terrible tragedies. In the very opening chapter, we find that Job goes through some horrific experiences. He loses all of his property, all of the wealth that he had been building through his entire life. He loses his children, not just 1 or 2 of them, but all of them through a series of just freak events. And then to top it all off, he experiences terrible suffering in his body, apparently out of nowhere. And the text makes a point in the first couple of chapters to note that in the midst of all of this, Job did not curse God. And so we speak about the patience of Job. But as Wilma pointed out in her sermon a couple of weeks ago, while Job may not have cursed God, he certainly was not afraid to question God. And through this questioning, he fundamentally reevaluates his beliefs about whether there is even a good God paying attention, overseeing the world. And this is the point where there's some friction between Job and his friends. You see, he has these friends who had come out to support him in the midst of his suffering. And for the first week, they did a wonderful job. They just sat in silence with him as a supportive presence. But when Job started complaining, talking about how the things that happened to him were unfair, and implicitly suggesting that maybe God was to blame, at that point, they just couldn't keep their mouths shut anymore. I had to say, okay, Job, we know that you're going through some difficult, challenging things, but let's not pin this on God, okay? I mean, we know that God is good, that God is just, and so if this happened, there had to have been a reason for it. I mean, surely there was something that you did to kind of cause this. But Job defends himself. He says, no way. I have been living with the same level of integrity that I have lived my entire life. This came out of nowhere. It was not a result of something that I did. And then, as they felt their social order being threatened, as people often do, they dug deeper into blaming the victim. Okay, Job, look, maybe you don't remember what it was that you did. Maybe you did something you didn't even realize it was wrong. Maybe God is just trying to teach you a lesson in humility. I mean, you are being kind of prideful here in the way that you're talking. But whatever it is, this could not have been something that God made a mistake about. Like, we're sorry, but you caused this. You deserved this at some level. And Job holds his ground. He says, no, that's not right. Even if I did make some kind of a mistake, even if I erred, this is a completely disproportionate response. This is not an appropriate response to my suffering. But although Job is arguing with his friends in the story, it becomes really clear that the audience that he really wants is not them, but God. Because what pains him more than anything is God's apparent absence. Why isn't God saying anything? Where is God in all of this? He would take anything, even a rebuke from God would give him some measure of peace rather than this haunting sense that God is not responding at all. And so Job presents us with these two views and this rich discussion between these two perspectives in the book. One perspective that begins with the conviction that there is a good and just God who oversees the universe and therefore asserts that everything that happens must in some sense be good and just and fair. And then another perspective that says, no, the things that happen in the world are not good and just and fair. But then wonders, what does that mean about God? Where is God in the midst of this? Well, we still have some more reading to do in the book of Job. We will finish that next week. So I'm just going to kind of let that hang there for us to think about for a minute. And I want to return to our main storyline, the story about God's relationship with the chosen people. And perhaps at this point, we should acknowledge that the chosen people have kind of gotten off easy up to this point. Because for the most part, God has treated them in precisely the way that Job's friends suggest God should. When they do things right, when they have faith, when they obey what God wants them to do, they're blessed. God gives them flocks, wealth, spouses, children. God protects them in the midst of a number of difficult situations. God's hand of blessing is upon them, and this is meant to be evidence that God is with them. Now, yes, there are times when they suffer in the story. Certainly, Isaac suffers in seeing his sons come in conflict with each other. Jacob suffers when he has to flee from Esau. But these are largely sufferings that come from their own mistakes and sins, not something that God is unjustly imposing upon. But this begins to change once we get to the story of Joseph. Because Joseph is the most righteous, honorable character in all of the book of Genesis. He just lives an exemplary life. Unlike his parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, he doesn't lie. He doesn't cower in the face of powerful people. He holds his integrity even when it could potentially cost him his safety or his life. And yet Joseph suffers more than any of his ancestors did. As Martha summarized so aptly, we could just list some of these things very quickly. You know, he begins by being sold into slavery by his own brothers just for telling a story about a dream that he had. and they're feeling jealousy because of the way their father treated him. And then while he's in slavery, he's trying to make the best of it. He's trying to do what he's supposed to do. And the slave owner's wife makes the accusation that he had tried to have an affair with her, even though the opposite was true. Knowing that she was a woman of privilege and that all she had to do was to pretend to be in distress to the people in power, she knew that he was vulnerable to being possibly killed or at least put in prison. And then, even when Job is put in prison, the injustice doesn't end, because while he's there, he's still trying to make the best out of the situation. And one of his fellow prisoners, a cupbearer, asks for his help in interpreting a dream. And after helping him, all that Joseph does is to ask him to remember him when he emerges. But once again, the person on the other side fails, and Joseph languishes longer still in prison. Again and again and again, Joseph faces a series of injustices for having done nothing wrong. In fact, it's actually worse than that, because Joseph suffers these injustices precisely because of his integrity, because he is trying to do things the right way. And you would think that this would be an appropriate time for Joseph to have the same kind of response that Job does. To say, okay, God, I don't see you here. This isn't fair. Where are you? And there's nothing wrong with asking those kinds of questions. Job, remember, is never punished for questioning God. In fact, is rewarded at the end for his clinging to the truth as valiantly as he does. But these questions don't seem to occur to Job. And you think, why? I mean, toward the end of his, at the peak of his suffering, he's dragged out before Pharaoh. And even at this moment, when he's asked to interpret Pharaoh's dream, before having heard it, he just has utter confidence that God will come through and provide. Well, unfortunately, the book of Genesis doesn't lay out his thinking in the same detail that the book of Job lays out Job's thinking. I mean, these are different kinds of texts, and so they write in different ways. But we do get a glimpse of Joseph's thinking at the very end of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 50, in this moment when he is in conflict when his brothers are afraid that he is going to take revenge on them after his father had died. And to read it one more time, he says in response to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today." Now, this is a profound statement. And I think it says a lot, not only about Joseph's faith, but about what kind of God it is that we are meeting in the book of Genesis. And so I want to take a little bit of time to really just break down this brief comment that we get at the end of Genesis. It starts out with the line, "Even though you intended it for harm." Now, what's significant about that is that Joseph does not excuse his brothers for their behavior. He doesn't just say, "Oh, well, don't worry about it. This was meant to happen. You were doing God's will. You were really just kind of pawns in this larger game going on. You couldn't help it." No, Joseph acknowledges that they were morally responsible for their action. You intended it for harm. He gives them agency, responsibility for what they did. And this fits with kind of a larger theme that has always been there in Genesis, but which is just particularly clear here. And that is that God does not treat his people like puppets He's not this puppet master who just kind of draws the strings and forces us to act in a particular way. Instead, God chooses to treat us like partners. We see this in a number of different places in the Bible. Perhaps one of the most striking of them is in this conversation that God has with Abraham. God had just revealed to Abraham and Sarah that they were going to have a child of promise, Isaac. And it says, when the men whom God had manifested himself in, when the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Now, this is really interesting, and what follows is a passage that's challenging for a lot of us as modern readers, because it gives the impression that God's will was kind of up in the air, that God hadn't fully decided what was going to happen yet. And God gives Abraham an opportunity to weigh in, to negotiate, to help God make the decision about what would happen next in this story. Now, to a certain extent, I think that this is a literary convention, that God was not really as wishy-washy about these things as the story might make it seem. But what it's trying to convey is that God's plans and God's actions are genuinely responsive to us as humans, that God treats us as partners, that we really have the free will to say yes or no. In fact, sometimes this is a little bit disturbing, the extent to which God gives us this freedom to say no and do harm. But this is how the God of the Bible wants to operate. He's a God who would rather speak through dreams and inspirations and give us the choice to respond than to force our hand in one way or another. Now, this is actually a little bit scary when you think about it, because it suggests that maybe God isn't actually in control, that God is just leaving it up to us as humans to determine the fate of the future, of reality. And quite frankly, I don't trust us as humans to make very good decisions with that kind of power. So we wonder if that's a responsible thing to do. But I want to go back to our quote from Genesis chapter 50, because then Joseph goes on to say, well, yes, even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people, as he's doing today. Now, Joseph remains convinced that even though God allows the humans to make this choice, even though his brothers were ultimately responsible for the harm that he experienced, that God is still in control. That God, in some way, was still guiding these actions, that God was able to take this bad thing that happened to him and use it for something good, something essential, in fact, that the people of God might have died of starvation had Joseph not been in Egypt working under Pharaoh and preserving grain, not only for his family, but for the entire world to eat during this terrible period of famine. Now, we have to be really careful when we're working here, because this is a tightrope that is difficult to walk. To be able to insist quite sincerely that no, God does not cause evil, that it's human beings who are responsible for those, but at the same time, God never lets go of the steering wheel. That God is still overseeing everything that happens. Rather than seeing God as a kind of puppeteer who controls everything, there are other metaphors that maybe get at God's sovereignty a little bit better. For example, some people have suggested that God engages with evil like a master chess player, and he gives evil the opportunity to move in whatever direction it wants, but whatever move it takes, he has a counter move prepared so that it will ultimately lead to the final conclusion. Or to use a less combative analogy, said before that God is kind of like a GPS, and that it's true that we are still the ones driving the car, And we can choose to go in a number of different directions, some of which are better and some of which are worse. But God always preserves a way for us to get home. This is the view of sovereignty that is promoted in Genesis. And it's a very strange kind of view. It suggests that God cannot always be seen in the successes and with the victors, but God very well may be present in the midst of the suffering and the failures. Well, this leads to this third point that I like to make, and that is that Joseph, in his perspective, because he believed this about God, that God could be working through evil without causing it, rejecting the kind of dichotomy between Job and his friends. It changed his perspective in every situation he entered. Because wherever he went, he believed that God had neither caused the evil, nor was God absent. And so he would say, where is God in this setting? Where can I find God here? And the text actually narrates that God is constantly with Joseph, even blessing Joseph in the midst of these horrific situations. So in Genesis chapter 39, for example, when he goes first to Potiphar's house, it says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Now, we have to take the word prospered with a grain of salt whenever we're talking about somebody who was a slave. Obviously, this was not an ideal situation. Joseph was forcibly removed from his family. He did not have freedom. He was a slave. But even then, God was still with him. We hear it again and later in the chapter. Then, when Joseph is sent to prison, that while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Because even though at that moment, at that low moment in Joseph's life, he had no way of seeing how this could possibly work toward anything good. I mean, he is hundreds of thousands of miles, well, maybe not hundreds of thousands, but he is far, far away from the rest of his family, and he is being kept at the lowest, most powerless place in society. But his belief that God is working toward good not only gives him hope for the future, but also helps him to be able to see God in the present, right there in the dungeon with him. And I think that this is telling and important for us, people of faith. And to go back to Job, I want to say that there is nothing wrong with Job's question. In fact, it's appropriate, even beneficial for us at times to be asking the hard questions about faith. And I don't believe that the depiction of God that I've given this morning fully answers Job's questions. There are still tough questions to ask about why God would allow so much evil, about why this can't happen another way. And if you really want to wrestle with these things together, that's actually going to be the focus of our Facing Hard Questions discussion this afternoon. So if this is something that is pulling at you, please feel free to join us. But even as these questions are being asked, Job brings in a different perspective. Perspective of faith that acknowledges that, yes, we might not know the answers to this. It might be appropriate to wrestle with the question. But Joseph was committed to looking for God, even in the midst of suffering. And this is what we as the people of God are called to do. When we see suffering in the world around us, say it takes the shape of a pandemic. We do not say that God caused the pandemic, but we do believe that God is at work doing something in the midst of it. And we look for that. And we see, how can we partner with God? When we hear about the tragedies of unjust killings by the police that are coming from racial bias, we do not say that this was God's will for these things to happen. We believe that even here, God can bring something good out of these terrible tragedies. And we look to God and say, how can you use us to be a part of that? There are some situations that are so low where it's hard to even imagine how anything constructive is coming out. There are some situations where it feels like we are facing the cross. Even then, we see God in the suffering alongside of us, not at a distance, but being with us all the way to the end. And so, as God's people, let us remember that the God that we serve, although we appropriately pray for healing and relief and freedom and redemption, that this is not a God who is going to force our hand, that this is not a God who is going to abandon us, but this is the God of dreams and dungeons. And we have to learn to look for this God in faith.